Okay, greetings everybody. Welcome to today's online seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute here at the LSE. My name is Mike Savage. I'm Professor of Sociology here, and I convene the III's theme around wealth, elites and tax justice. Really pleased to be hosting this talk with my colleague Kristin Surak, who's in the Department of Sociology with me, as well as being a collaborator on our research theme. Her seminar will be called Citizenship for Sale, Millionaires and Microstates and Mobility. It's going to be a part of a forthcoming book, which she has nearly finished and will be published by Harvard University Press next year. And I'm sure will cause lots of interest given the topicality of this issue. As the event is in Zoom meeting rather than webinar format, we can see the audience, and this makes it a more interactive and enjoyable event for all of us. Please keep yourself muted, but it's nice to see you on video, particularly when we get the Q&A towards the end. So what we plan to do is for Kristin to talk for about 40 minutes and then leave about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. If you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function, or you can put the question into the chat function on Zoom. Please state your name and affiliation in both cases. Before we make a start, let me just also quickly say that this is part of a regular seminar series which we hold in the III. The next event looks extremely exciting next week, Tuesday, 24th of May, and the theme is Social Reproduction and Care, What's in a Name? To be given by Sarah Farris and Naila Kabir. So hopefully this will whet the appetite for more to come. Okay, I think that's all I need to say. I'm going to hand over to Kristin and look forward to hearing her talk. Kristin, the floor is yours.
Hey, terrific. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about some material coming out in my forthcoming book that's really part of a much larger project that I've been working on over the past 5 years in this world of investment migration, basically the global market in citizenship. I'm not terribly familiar with, or don't know how many of you are familiar with this market or with this trade in the first place. I mean, maybe some of you have encountered it back in the pre-COVID days, if anything, in the adverts in British Airways in-flight magazine, where, declaring global citizenship, where there would always be a pull-out section in the middle where, showing how you can invest and become a citizen of St. Kitts, Dominica, or St. Lucia. If you're flying to the country of Antigua, for example, which sells citizenship, when you go through immigration at the airport, right above the immigration booths, there's even a big sign advertising their Citizenship by Investment program. And there's even big trade fairs in major global hubs like Moscow and Hong Kong, Dubai, where both governments and service providers pitch their projects, and you can go around visiting the booths to see different countries and their different options. Here too are, for example, the bureaucrats from various Caribbean countries with programs talking about what they have on offer to an audience of service providers and potential investor citizens. And there's even gala events like the Global Citizen Forum. This one was set up in some geodesic domes on the Adriatic coast, where you can find people like Robert De Niro or Cherie Blair, Tony Blair's wife, coming out and proclaiming the need for global citizens with the entrepreneurial skills that we all should share. Basically, it's a big PR event for the sale of citizenship. So all of this wraps into this intriguing world of citizenship by investment or golden passports. And I found exploring this very interesting because citizenship in some places in the world is so often seen in almost sacred terms as this kind of inviolate bond between sovereign and subject. It's kind of a key nexus of political belonging, and it's a fundament for making various claims to various rights. But now we find states selling it. And so what I do in this project is I look at how the sale of citizenship is possible in the first place, why states do it, why people want to buy it, especially in peripheral countries, and then what this tells us about broader power relations within the global political economy, about the relationship between states and markets, about the nature of sovereignty, and about the interlayerings of global inequality more broadly. All right, so to get a little bit more into detail, to just what is this and what is citizenship by investment? To understand it, it's useful to distinguish it from two neighboring phenomena that often get conflated with it, but in fact are quite distinct. So first of all, any sovereign can grant citizenship on whatever grounds it wants, and in fact, in international law, there's very little that can impinge on what a state, decides in terms of naturalization. So, Cambodia made, for example, I guess LSE professor of practice Angelina Jolie a citizen based on her environmental work there. And they can do it for investment reasons too. So New Zealand naturalized the founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, after he went to the country for about a week, bought some luxury properties, and donated to an earthquake relief fund. Recently, Snapchat did the same thing recently France did the same thing for Snapchat CEO Evan Spiegel. But these are slightly different from citizenship by investment. These are cases of individualized discretionary grants of citizenship for economic reasons, what I call discretionary economic citizenship. Citizenship by investment, though, is different. These are formal programs. They have clearly defined price points, clearly defined investment types, timeframes, background checks. It's not just cash for passports, even though people often reduce it to that. It's this extended process that's relatively transparent and formal and not individualized. And that's what really can make it into a mass market product. You can even find it on government websites. So for example, this is the St. Kitts government website for its program, where you get a statement from the Prime Minister, a video from the CEO of the Citizenship Investment Unit that processes applications. And this one is describing their latest limited time offer. Citizenship by investment is also different from golden visa programs. These are residence by investment visas. So things like in the UK, the now defunct Tier 1 investor visa, probably more famously within the EU, there's the Portuguese golden visa, the Spanish golden visa. The US has a version in its EB5 program. These are actually really quite common across the world. But citizenship by investment is different because it's citizenship and not residence that's on offer. And there's really important differences between the two. So citizenship is inheritable. You can pass it down to your children, whereas residence is not. Citizenship comes with the possible access to a passport. Passports are, of course, always owned by governments. You never own your passport. You can only apply to a government to get one. But residence is just a visa in a passport, and that's a big difference. Plus, citizenship is relatively hard to lose. You can usually sell the investment after 3 to 5 years, and you'll still be a citizen. Whereas with residence, quite typically, once you sell the investment, you usually can't renew the visa. You lose that as well. And on top of it, a lot of people who go for residence by investment programs, these golden visa programs, actually don't naturalize either. In fact, they're doing that precisely because they don't want citizenship. Perhaps if their country doesn't allow dual citizenship, for example. And so I think this is a common mistake, but it's really important not to conflate the two. So for the past 5 years, I've been looking into these programs to understand how they operate, not just on paper, but also in practice. So I carried out field work in 16 countries on 4 continents, doing interviews, hundreds of interviews, basically with lawyers, service providers, government officials, and the wealthy buyers, and talking with local populations too, on top of collecting documentary evidence and putting together a statistical database on or a data set on the programs as well. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit more. Just where are these programs? Currently, there's about 16 countries with operating schemes. Here you can see how they really take off from about 2014 onward. Most are in British colonies with common law provisions and something of an offshore industry as well. But this has been changing, especially in recent years, with the spread of programs in sizable Middle East countries, places like Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, for example. And more countries are potentially coming on board. Places like Albania, Georgia, Croatia, Panama have been in discussions about it. So it looks like this may continue to spread among different countries. What does it take to apply? Here's a comparison of what some of the offerings look like. In terms of investment options, on the left, you can see applicants usually invest in approved real estate projects or a business, or else they donate money to the government. Minimum investments usually range from about 100,000 US dollars to over 2 million euros, plus on top of it fees, and the fees can be significant, the ones that are paid to the country. Processing time can be, a few months, usually at a max about a year or so. And then there's that issue of physical presence. Usually those are pretty minimal. Some cases you have to go to the country, give biometric information, swear an oath. But in many cases, you don't even have to go to the country at all in order to naturalize in it. If we look at demand, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, kind of picking apart why people go for this. My research shows that currently about 50,000 people naturalize through these schemes annually. And this graph looks only up through 2019, right before COVID, because COVID did have a big impact on this, not only in terms of processing applications, but in terms of governments just getting their data up on websites as well. So this basically goes up to COVID. And in looking at approved applications, there's obviously a difference very often between approvals and demand because of rejection rates. In some countries, this can be pretty high. In Malta, the rejection rates were sometimes as high as 30%, but for the most part, they're pretty low, 5% or less in most cases. And here, there's a couple of interesting things to note. So you can see how, up until the late 2010s, the field was really dominated by Caribbean options, which are at the bottom in purple. It was really a story of cheaper Caribbean programs processing a lot of people, followed by then adding in programs in green in the EU, so Malta and Cyprus. And then by about 2017, 2018, we see Vanuatu in the Pacific getting into the scene a little bit more. But now, ever since 2018, Turkey has really taken off. Basically, what happened is it dropped its minimum investment amount from about $1 million US to 250,000. So, and you can invest in real estate. So all you have to do is buy a nice house in Istanbul or in a resort area, and Turkish citizenship is yours. And there's been a complete explosion. They're now processing about 1,000 applications per month, which means that Turkey now accounts for about 60% of the global market. Now, these are just approved applications. And my research has also shown that on average, about 1.6 family members are included on each application as well. Because often when you apply for something like citizenship or a visa, you can bring your family reunion possibilities allow you to bring your family members as well. So for each approved application, there's probably 2.6 people becoming citizens in all of this. Now, all of this might look pretty small, 50,000 people globally, global population, whatever, 7 or 8 billion. But if you look at where demand usually comes from, that's usually first generation new wealth from the global south with at least $1 million or $2 million in liquid assets, often a little bit more, but it's a ballpark figure of about 2 to 3 million people who are really, the key kind of target areas for this traditionally. So in that sense, it's actually a much more significant proportion of the potential population of demand. Where are they coming from? It depends in part on where they're going or not going. But the key areas of demand are China, the Middle East, and Russia. And these are all areas of mass privatization and great wealth accumulation, often under authoritarian regimes, also often with oil wealth and a lot of unrest as well. And as I'll talk a little bit about later, geopolitics affects this enormously, as you might imagine. So here you can see that usually Russians they're in green, they tend to go for EU options. They tend to have more business connections to the EU. They're about 50% of the people getting citizenship through these programs in the EU, which is much different than what the image that the media often projects, that they're all Russian oligarchs, which is certainly not the case. A lot of Middle Easterners, you can see those in red, they tend to go for places in the Caribbean, easy passport, a cheap passport. And I'll talk a little bit about why they would go for that later. But before COVID, actually, most were from China. However, China doesn't show up in the numbers very well, which is basically because China forbids dual citizenship. So a lot of countries that tend to have a lot of Chinese applicants don't like to release numbers. So, take, for example, St. Kitts, it recognizes Taiwan and not mainland China. So it could be a very safe option if you're a Chinese national getting a second citizenship. And officials there say about 2/3 of the approvals are for Chinese. China really is, up until COVID, was about 50% of the global market. COVID has had a big impact because still it's very difficult to leave China. But people are predicting that it's actually going to recover once Shanghai gets out of lockdown and people, make a run for the exits. So all of this then raises a question about, why, for example, would a wealthy Vietnamese businesswoman want to buy citizenship in, say, Antigua in the Caribbean? And the answer usually isn't tax evasion, because a lot of these people are from places where the governments aren't very effective in collecting taxes in the first place. And it's a question that I find quite interesting, because we typically think of citizenship as about a bond between a sovereign and a subject. It's about the rights it gets people within a state. And there's a big literature on this, or also on second-class citizenship as well. But citizenship by investment highlights the fact that citizenship gets benefits outside of a country too. So if you're becoming a citizen in Antigua, it's not about what it gets you in Antigua, it's about what it gets you in Europe, or what it gets you in Dubai even. And that's what buyers seek: extraterritorial rights and possibilities. And because of this, because the value lies largely in extraterritorial benefits secured in third countries, the value of citizenship as a commodity is fundamentally shaped not by the country issuing it, but by external politics and geopolitics as well. They really control, external players control the value. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail now. So if you go around asking people why they seek out citizenship by investment, most will say that they're pursuing mobility options in the present. Very often, this is visa-free access to Europe, but it's not only that. And this won't come to a surprise to anybody who's from a place outside of the global north. If you're traveling on a Chinese, Russian, Syrian, Nigerian documents, it's often very difficult to get a visa, especially if you're a business person and you need to get on a plane in a short order. It becomes very inconvenient if you have to wait for weeks and give all sorts of documentations until you can get a visa approved. So, for example, one wealthy Asian naturalizer I spoke to said, everything in his life, as he put it, happens at the last minute. So being able to travel freely, as he said, really makes a difference. Or another service provider I spoke to in London described the motives of his latest client as, he may be rich, but if he can't travel to London whenever he wants, he will always be second class. He was a person from the subcontinent. So there's a hierarchy of citizenships that can stymie cross-border mobility. However, it's not one set in stone. The strength of it is determined by external politics and geopolitics as well. So, for example, talking to an agent in Dubai described a recent client who was from Iran. He said, he has to supply so many documents when he applies for a visa. They're all correct, but at the embassies, they still think you're Iranian, you're a terrorist. And in his case, he wasn't getting a new citizenship to get visa-free access to Schengen. It was in order to get easier access to visas to the US and the UK. So, for example, there's a big market in Dubai among doctors from Iran who have to get reaccredited every 2 years. And they prefer to do this reaccreditation in the UK or US. And it's simply easier to travel on a document from the Caribbean. It still has their place of birth and all of that, but they're much less likely to get their visa refused. And if they do, it makes it impossible to get another visa for these places. But these geopolitical issues aren't set in stone. So if a country negotiates a bilateral treaty, visa treaty with another country, China's done this with the US. It's much easier if you're Chinese to get a 10-year multi-entry visa to the US. It hits demand as well. So it can become easier. But it can go the other way too. Borders can harden as well. It's very, very difficult right now to travel on a Russian passport, for example, or a Belarusian passport. But it's been so actually since 2015, since the Skripal poisoning and the annexation of Crimea as well, which did lead to an increase in people looking for these other options. And you can even find people with good passports seeking out alternatives too. Many Americans might look for a quote unquote peaceful passport. If you're a US citizen working in Yemen or Ethiopia, for example, you might do better to get a passport from the Comoros or even the Caribbean, to avoid kidnapping, for example. And it can also mean, mobility can mean the possibility to stay where you are. So for a while, Venezuela stopped renewing its passports. So if you're a Venezuelan oil worker working in Kuwait or Qatar or the UAE, and you have an expiring passport, where do you put your residence permit, your work visa? So there was an increase in people from Venezuela trying to get passports in order to stay where they are. So there's a lot more going on than just visa-free access to the EU here. But it's not just present mobility, it's also often future mobility, a sort of plan B, which can be very nice too. This is a plan B in Malta, for example. So the wealthy are very risk averse. They have a lot more to lose than most people, and they're very anxious to hold on to their assets, which many of them accumulate by, as sociologist Kimberly Wong puts it, playing in the gray. So, for example, a service provider I spoke to in Russia said, of the local scene, business people like working in the gray. There's money in it, but they want it backed up in black and white. So if you're living under an authoritarian regime, you don't know what's going to happen, what Putin is going to do, what Xi Jinping is going to do, in a place where you don't trust the government. The idea behind this for a lot of people is to, as one interviewee described, retain flexibility. They want an exit option that's there just in case. And you can find this outside of authoritarian regimes too. So US presidential elections recently have produced these waves of Armageddon Americans who either want out of Trump's fascism or Biden's communism or whatever. They're just not happy with the regime and feel unsafe or uncertain. It can also be, a mixture of these internal, external politics. So, a lot of Taiwan, Hong Kong, for example, no matter, depending on what's going on with China, people get very concerned and look for exit options as well. Or, kind of a future plan B. And in many of these cases, people aren't looking to move immediately. They're just looking to hedge risks. And some people do this multiple times. So I met one lawyer who described a Saudi zillionaire client who had been locked up in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh by Mohammed bin Salman. And when he came out, as he put it, he wanted everything: Canada, a European golden visa, a second passport. And so some people go through these programs sequentially. They become serial investor migrants. And I've been able to identify some of these populations in my quantitative work, where they acquire investor citizenship in one country and then apply for residence or citizenship in yet another country. So the country with the highest per capita people acquiring UK investor visas, the country with the greatest number of people per capita doing that was St. Kitts. That was followed by Monaco, which probably isn't too terribly surprising, but St. Kitts is a middle-income country, followed then by Dominica, also a middle-income country. So these are very likely to be people who've gotten citizenship through citizenship by investment. And number three, people are interested in accessing business opportunities. Here, the EU is the clearest case, where Cyprus's program is now defunct, but when it was there, you could naturalize in Cyprus, or else go to Malta, which is still running a program. And becoming citizens in those places facilitates business activities across the entire union. So, opening up bank accounts or getting lines of credit, et cetera. When you're a citizen of an EU member state, it's like being a citizen of 27 different countries. So as a service provider in Dubai described, if you're doing business between the EU and the Middle East, it makes your life much easier if you're holding a European passport while you're banking, setting up a business. As he put it, it's much easier to be European. It's much more efficient. And this applies outside of Europe too. So in the Middle East, one of the cases I encountered was an Egyptian business person doing business with Israel, and had become a citizen of Cyprus, which to simply make it easier. So you can see geopolitics is quite crucial here too. But it's important to remember that people are not just looking to access the West, which is how this is often reduced in a lot of media accounts and political debates here. So if you're Iranian in the UAE, it's become extraordinarily challenging over the past 15 years to find a bank that will open an account to give you a mortgage or extend a credit line for your business simply because of your passport. So what do? You get citizenship in Dominica. It's $100,000 US. It's basically a business expense. And in fact, it might even increase your salary, because salaries in the UAE, it's a place where 90% of the workforce is foreign, and salaries are typically pegged to one's citizenship. So you could have a French citizen, a St. Kitts citizen, and a Nigerian citizen all getting paid different amounts of money for the same job. So there's a lot of different benefits that these things can bring within, even outside of the West. In thinking about business opportunities, do these people, when they invest in businesses or real estate, do they see this as a profit-making investment? Usually no. They can be they'll usually be making more money if they put their money elsewhere. Some of them will move some financial assets or some financial structures in or through the new country. As I said, they've got offshore financial services, set up a parallel family office, move some holding companies. A lot of these countries are, have common law as well. And all of this helps create substance. So if you want to look into tax options, it becomes possible, but these are always quite individual and quite complicated. And it's important to remember here that all of the main tools of wealth structuring, whether they're foundations or trusts or shell companies, they can all be easily done without citizenship by investment. And in fact, if citizenship by investment were an easy solution to tax, half of the West's millionaires and billionaires would be going for these programs, but they're not. They're not the key sources of demand. Although you do get some expat Americans renouncing US citizenship because of the way that the US handles taxes, as well as because of pressure coming after FATCA in 2010, which is often for Americans living abroad for a very long time, makes interactions with banks very difficult because they have to report on US citizens. Now, importantly, to move into the upshots of this, looking at this, we basically see that, people from outside the West, what people are looking for are things that people in the West usually take for granted. They're looking for mobility opportunities, business opportunities that, simply aren't available to them because they're coming from outside of the West. In fact, there's a substantial inequalities between citizenships, which creates one of the key reasons for demand. Sociologist Yossi Harpaz has written about this in terms of, as he puts it, compensatory citizenship. That is, people look to strategically naturalize elsewhere in order to make up for the failures of their citizenship at birth. I would argue, though, that this doesn't quite capture what's going on here, because many of these buyers are very wealthy in the first place, precisely because they were nationals of China or Russia or Vietnam at a particular historical juncture, that is, at a particular point in time of mass privatizations of previously public assets, and they had the right connections. You don't become a Russian oligarch if you're from Nigeria. You don't become Chinese nouveau riche if you're from India, or even really if you're from Taiwan. So it was, precisely because of their citizenship at birth, that was one of the precipitating conditions for accumulating great wealth in the first place. So in that sense, most of these people are not merely victims of an unequal world of borders. It's more complicated than that. You can actually divide that into multiple different sorts of populations as well. But I think those blanket terms are really don't capture the nuances of the dynamics that are relevant here. But one of the key upshots of this is that there's effectively a double system of inequality in operation. That is, both between countries in terms of what citizenship gets a person, and within countries between basically the have-nots and the have-much-mores. And the solution to this in some sectors has been this development that effectively inverts our classic assumptions of citizenship. If we look at the classical work, by T.H. Marshall, LSE man, he observed 70 years ago that citizenship is the great equalizer. That is, it basically over time reaches downward to include ever poorer classes. And it's citizenship that supplies a modicum of equality within a world of capitalist inequality. Here, by contrast to Marshall's account, we find moneyed people leveraging their economic resources to escape the limits of their citizenship of birth once it becomes a hindrance, and many do so to safeguard themselves. And they're doing so also to facilitate lives outside of the West. They're trying to set up a business with Israel. They're trying to get a mortgage in Dubai, and they're trying to get their kids into school into Shenzhen. Alongside it, but it can be both, as well, but it's not simply a story of the people from the global South trying to batter down the fortress Europe, for example. And so, getting outside of this kind of Western navel gazing is really essential to understand how the market works. All of this points to one of the most remarkable characteristics of citizenship by investment, which is namely that in terms of our presumptions about citizenship, we often think about it as concerning rights gained within a country. However, the value of investor citizenship often rests in what it secures outside it. That is, in extraterritorial privileges that extend citizenship's benefits beyond the boundaries of the granting state. So enabling these advantages in the first place are usually treaties and alliances, which are usually formed to encourage the free flow of capital of goods in the first instance, and then they are formed to encourage the free flow of labor in the second. And they simultaneously produce the benefits that buyers seek, whether it's visa-free access, the right of abode, possibility to establish a business, schooling options, etc. So even under advanced globalization, the citizenship of capitalists may still hinder the cross-border flow of their money, which is something a different set of documents might circumvent. So though we see that there's a citizenship hierarchy, one that fluctuates, its ranking doesn't determine all demand. So we also see individuals with top citizenships, like US citizens, seeking out citizenship by investment solutions in countries lower down on the hierarchy. Now, most common are Americans with lives based outside of the US, whose nationality becomes a liability in their eyes, whether it's US pressure on international banks to report, or whether it's the danger of traveling on a US passport, or whether they want to simply escape the US tax net. So it's not all people just trying to move up a citizenship hierarchy. What about strategizing as well? A lot of people find this sort of morally reprehensible, that people could strategize around something seen as quasi-sacred. But people, especially Yossi Harpaz's work, has shown that individuals from middle to low income countries are usually great strategizers when it comes to naturalization. They seek out economic opportunities and mobility options using ancestry routes whenever they can, or birth tourism, or even investment residence visas, for example. And in this sense, the super rich in middle to low income countries as well are not too terribly different. So thus, as strategizers, these investor citizens perhaps distinguish themselves more in terms of degree than actual kind as well. So what's the upshot of all of this? I'll close with the upshot for citizenship. I'll close with a few points I recently made, namely that, if we look at our conventional accounts or conventional understandings of citizenship, we see it as often naturalization comes out of immigration. You move to a country and you naturalize after spending time there. Citizenship by investment schemes reconfigure this. It's not the person, but her money that needs to be resident for a defined period, contributing to the economy in the same way that labor might. If we look at the modern state as both the modern sort of nation state as a hegemonic form now, as both a territorial organization and a membership organization, as combining this nation and state, we can see that there's a disjuncture between the two that might be even increasing as countries that strive to bring into their ambit, but not always into their terrain, desired populations. So in this way, states embrace, and they do this, like with athletes and scientists and all of that, states embrace of these external investor citizens that don't live in the country, try not to visit it if they can. It can, in some ways, resemble this extension of dual citizenship to immigrants, labor migrants who go abroad, in order by countries that are trying to encourage their financial transfers back home. So, for example, Mexico extended new nationality clauses to particularly Mexican former Mexican citizens living in the US in order to make sure that they feel a connection and send their remittances back. And there's that similar kind of extraterritorial reach going on here. But unlike the inclusion of remittance sending immigrants into it, in those cases, it becomes a transnational diaspora. These investor citizens, they don't stretch the hyphen between the nation state into a diaspora, but really slice it. They have no interest in the imagined communities of the nation. And the states that are issuing investor citizenship aren't trying to foster multicultural identities. These are non-present citizens that are members of the state, but not the nation. And in that sense, they're very different from diaspora populations. Demand, if we look at this in the long run, demand for citizenship by investment is going to persist as long as there are countries in the global south producing wealthy citizens looking to improve their travel options or for an insurance policy, or for business opportunities. And this will continue as long as geopolitical conflict plays out in the realm of mobility and global flows. And overall, these findings coming out of this work are consonant with this literature that's been going out there for a while on the thing of citizenship, coming out of the work of Kristin, moving from this sort of identity-laden, singular relationship to a state that imposes duties towards a more strategically leveraged legal status guaranteeing rights. So that's sort of the upshot of what I wanted to talk about today. I've been working on this for a while, and I'll flag just sort of a set of publications that have come out recently based on this work, which is really looking at the global nature and interconnections of these flows as well. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say on this. I don't know, should I stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions?
I think so, Kristin, yes, if you can, then we can see everyone hopefully on screen. Look, that's fantastically interesting, and you open up so many issues about the nature of citizenship, the nature of the nation state, the role of wealth and equality, and so thank you ever so much. So I'm now going to hand over to Q&A, and if you want to ask a question, either put your hand up, and we can have you on screen, and it'd be lovely to see you all with your cameras on, for those of you who wish to do that. If you'd rather put a question in chat, then that's also possible. So who would like to ask the first question? Chico.
Hi, Kristin. Thanks a lot. That was really, really interesting. So I'm gonna try to be a little provocative in the first part of my question, but then I have a very specific non-provocative thing at the end. And the provocative bit comes from the perspective of someone who, in the world's airports, always has to queue with the people who don't have good passports, as you said. That is the greatest inequality in our world today, right? Is based on where you were born. Now, the thing here is these people are rich, so we're supposed to dislike them, right? So if they were migrants who were poor, then we're on their side, but because they're rich, we dislike them. So, I think you did do a nice job of being quite balanced about those two kinds of inequalities. So on the one hand, they're rich. On the other, there's citizens from countries in the global south who are often the victim of the international economic injustice, and they're buying this right to travel more freely and so on and so forth. So in the end, it's a policy decision governments have to make. So governments have to make a decision whether this is a good or a bad thing. Sometimes to ask whether something is a good or a bad thing is naive, but in this case, it's not, because it's a decision, it's a policy decision. And to me, it would seem that it matters a great deal whether these really are, these Russian oligarchs, people who benefited from unjust forms of privatization or what have you, or not. And on that, you mentioned those things, but I saw few numbers. I don't know if you have data on how these people made their money or how rich they really are. I mean, $100,000, you could be a university professor in the United States, maybe not here, but in the United States, you could be a university professor and easily buy citizenship in Antigua if you wanted to, and maybe without having done anything particularly wrong. So do we know whether these people are, beastly, evil capitalists or not? That's the question. Thanks.
Do we want to gather some questions up, or if there's anyone who wants to follow on from that, that's fine. Otherwise, Kristin can answer straight away while everyone else is thinking. Okay, Kristin, what are your?
Okay, I'll go ahead and answer, but I do like the idea of collecting a few of those.
Yep.
If you know about data for that, that would be fantastic. Can you imagine how hard it is to get good data on that? Can you imagine how hard it is to get interviewees with people who've actually gone through the programs in the first place? So it's not easy. So what I try to do in the absence of good data on that is to get a sense of the diversity that's out there. So it's really sort of a diversity maximizing strategy. In the first place, I'm not going to get an oligarch who's going to give me an interview, but you can read about those cases in the newspapers and things like that. But what I've been struck by is you know, in a sense, in trying to maximize diversity, there's a couple of things that go on. One is, you know, talk to a lot of service providers and see what they describe. And then, you know, of course, they're going to describe cases that they'll probably find, you know, real cases, but also ones that they think an academic would want to hear about. You can also ask about what are their competitors' business practices and get a little bit more information and things like that. I spent a lot of time going to these kind of, you know, those fairs, those information sessions, and some of those are business to business oriented, some of those are business to client oriented, and you can walk around and ask people who are shopping for these things, what are they looking for, you know, what's their background, you know, and all of that. So I do recognize there's obviously that, you know, I'm not, a criminal is not going to talk to me and give me an interview. I'm not going to get that. I rely on newspaper reporters for that sort of thing. But one thing I was quite struck by in looking at the Al Jazeera links of the Cyprus papers. So Al Jazeera got, you know, all the documents from of the people who went through naturalized in Cyprus, and looked at, they found that I can't remember, 4 or 5% were PEPs, politically exposed persons. Not meaning that they had any, you know, criminal indictments or anything against them, but if they were to have those, they would be more difficult to find, and usually banks and financial sector will do a stronger vet on people like that, which I found kind of surprisingly small, because Cyprus was 2.5 million. So you had to have serious assets to apply for it. Al Jazeera was exposing a corrupt workaround to the program by paying off the head of parliament and all that. But still, you know, doing that survey of all the applications, it revealed only, 4% or 5% of PEPs were in there. So I found that quite striking. This question of did they get the money legitimately or not? Yeah, I mean, yeah, how do you measure that? How do you measure, I mean, capital, the Rockefellers, did they get their money legitimately? I mean, you know, there's a lot of dirty business that goes on in capitalism. Not all of it, but it is hard to, you know, it'd be great to have quantitative numbers on this, but I think it's just, yeah, if anybody has any ideas, let me know.
Thank you, thank you. Any further questions? I mean, I've got one while people are waiting, which is, so as you pointed out, many of the states doing this investment citizenship are small states. And I kind of wonder how significant are these income streams from the point of view of those states? I mean, is it a significant share of their national income which is being earned, or their state income which is being earned from these things? And then also following on from that, I mean, it does seem that Turkey is really interesting to get into this, because Turkey is a big state, a powerful state, and it makes us think about, will other states follow Turkey's lead? So I kind of wondered if you want to say a bit more about what is, particularly around the issue about what is involved in the Turkey moving into this market.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah, as long as there's not a. In terms for the small states, the microstates, 100,000, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 population, it's huge. Yeah. It can be anywhere between, it can get as high as 50% of GDP. Right. By a generous estimate. I think a realistic estimate, and I'm working on a paper right now that does that, or I've got a forthcoming one basically. It comes down to about 30%, because there's a lot of kind of transaction costs, market costs, and things like that go into it. But in some countries, the government fees alone are huge. They can collect more in fees than they do in taxes, for example. All taxes, not just income taxes. Mm-hmm. So it can be, it's huge. Like there's a serious dependence issue in a lot of these places. Because for a product but that's also the case in a lot of these microstates. They're heavily dependent on tourism too, and after COVID-19, that shut down. So it really increased dependence on this as a revenue source. In terms of Turkey, I need to get down there. I had plans to go there, and then COVID-19 hit, and so. I've done like Zoom interviews to get a sense of what's going on, but I still don't have a really fine grasp of, all those dynamics going through it. So in terms of Turkey as a market leader, I think an interesting thing would be to look at whether it sees itself as competing or not. It did lower its price point in order to make it more competitive. Because it came in at it doesn't offer what an EU country does, but it was priced at an EU country's price. But at this point in time, it might not see itself as needing to compete in a market. And in terms of its economy, it's huge. Like this doesn't make any kind of difference at all.
Yes.
So I need to know a little bit more about what was, government motives, lobbying groups,
Yes.
and what's going on with Istanbul real estate. Because actually Istanbul real estate is going through the roof anyways. And Turkish lira has been going down, so there's a lot of different dynamics that play into that. It's also, unusually for these countries, it's one where people see it as a place they want to be as well.
Right.
Why not go to a lovely Mediterranean, coastal resort city, or you can, have a second base in Istanbul, bring in your businesses as well. So in that sense, Turkey is a real outlier to what has traditionally been a story of microstates.
Yes.
Compared to other ones, Egypt, Jordan, big countries, such low numbers, they don't matter.
Thank you. Okay, it's a question in the chat from Luna Glucksberg from the II. Did you notice any way in which gender was significant in your research? Did women do anything differently? And how about families and kin networks, which I know you touched upon a bit, but can you expand on it? Many thanks for the interesting presentation.
Gender, I'd say, people who are doing it solo, just themselves, are usually business people, which in many parts of the world means businessmen. But if they're doing it as a family, one of the things that's happened more frequently in the past, countries are cracking down on this, would be to have the spouse be the main applicant on the application. There's two reasons, there's two sort of key, probably more than that, but one can divide it into, reasons that are probably okay, and then reasons that are probably not okay. So reasons that are okay would be something like and often these are kind of in these traditional things where it's the businessman and then the spouse, mother of the children. The businessman might have government contracts, so he's not going to get citizenship elsewhere. But he comes from a place where there's violence, danger, blah blah blah, and so gets citizenship for the wife and kids, and the wife puts the kids in foreign schools. The wife accompanies the kids, but that man doesn't want to put his relationship with his home government into doubt in some sort of way. It can also be, and it can be also just much more pragmatically, that only that's needed. You want to put your kids in, in schools in Switzerland. And so, you put the mother as the main applicant or something like that. Then there's a more dubious one, which is traditionally some countries have run due diligence checks, background checks on only the main applicant. So you put the spouse, traditionally the wife, on there, who doesn't have all the complicated business. It could be also just, it's easier because the husband could have complicated business things that, some of these applications people would describe as, being 15 files 2 inches thick because of their business interests in so many different countries. And if you have to show the source of wealth from all these places, one person was describing having to roll on a trolley all of the application materials. So it could be just a matter of simplicity, but it could also be a matter of getting around due diligence, which would be run only on the main applicant. And then bring in the person with the more questionable background in as a spouse or dependent.
Thank you. Matt Reynolds.
Yeah, thanks also for me. Brilliant presentation, Kristin. Off the back of your point about Turkey and that being the exception to the rule, did you get a sense from your interviews how much time these people spent in the countries they had got passports from? Did they even have to go there to kind of fill out the paperwork, or was it all very much done remotely? I'm just curious whether they're kind of completely divorced from these microstates, or whether they do go there a bit for various reasons.
Most will avoid it if they can, because it's a hassle and it might not even be easy to get to. And there's not really much there for them anyways. Malta and Cyprus required biometric information, and so you did have to go to the country physically yourself twice. Malta had you had to show your intent to live in the country. Most people, talk to a number of people, they would say, spend like 2 weeks or a month, but you could also find people who did much less time in those places as well. But usually the idea, you can always find exceptions. I definitely found exceptions. And I was even traveling around in St. Kitts, I found investor citizens who wanted to check out their investment and see the place as well. I've met one on the plane even who was flying to renew his passport. So some people do, but most prefer not to. Avoid it.
Great, thank you.
Pratap.
Good evening. May I?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm speaking from India, from University of Delhi. I teach social work, and also we teach identity from a very social science perspective to our students. I read the note and I tried to hear you. Some of it is accessible, some of it is not accessible. So with those limitations, I am putting my thoughts and conclusions. So so is there a pattern? Just I would like to know. It appears that the new scenario is because of capitalist forces. This is what I try to see. So if the capitalist forces is the main reason behind the change, so then first, is it so? And if it is so, is there a pattern between, now we have so many worlds, global south, global north, developed countries. So the, colonial nations and, otherwise. So we have different now, geographical terms. So if it is capitalist force, is there a force among these geographical, terms, patterns? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by capitalist force, but it certainly is a story of capitalism and sort of great wealth accumulation and global flows and globalization, for sure. I suppose also thinking about the role of capitalism. One of the big differences, one of the reasons why you have this now, and it looks different from now from what you saw in the 1990s, in a sense, I trace the origin of this current market to Hong Kong. When it became clear in 1984 that Hong Kong would return to what was then a much more communist China, people began to look for exit options, and there was a big booming market around Hong Kong up until 1998. And then, so it was this sort of, capitalist entrepot, that might, go back to then much more communist Beijing was the key concern. And then if you look at what happened afterwards, China becomes much more capitalist in its orientation, joins the WTO, which means that it has to, get rid of a lot of its exit restrictions on its population. Same thing with the fall of the Soviet Union. It used to be much more restricted exit for these places as well. So I think it's, so in a sense, it's, capitalism, great wealth accumulation, but then also, increasing interconnectivity and the lowering of exit barriers too.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. Any more questions? Well, there's a point in the chat about comparative study between the developed nations of the north and the developing of the south. I mean, and obviously your analysis was global, and you're obviously very comprehensive in terms of the way you're discussing this. Because I wonder if you want to reflect upon how you see relations between the global north and global south being impacted by the dynamics you unravel here.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, if we look at, all countries are selective. All countries, allow some people in and don't allow others in when it comes to migration issues and border control. And most countries don't allow people in from other countries that have lower GDPs. They don't, it's not a matter of the individual person, it's a matter of what is that, quote unquote, level of economic development. And that becomes a key mode of keeping people out. So in that sense, in thinking about this relationship between how the economic development of global north nations, and here almost implied is sort of in a kind of vampire-like relationship, or kind of neo-colonial dependency on relationship with the development of the global south, or other sorts of relationships of inequality can be possible as well. I think that's a key one. That countries don't allow try to select out people from places that are poorer on a sort of global basis. But yeah, you can also tell the story of microstates in all of this. Former colonies trying to get by, in a sense, they kind of hustle, as I describe it, they hustle in the global political economy to do what they can. And I remember doing an interview in St. Kitts with a DJ who was very, he was an Afro-nationalist DJ, and he was very proud of this country's program and very defensive about it too. And it was like, why are we selling citizenship? Why do we have citizenship in the first place? And he went on, you know, it was like, it's because of European colonization, you know, the slave trade with Africa, you know, the triangle trade and all of this, you know, because of that, we have this country of St. Kitts. And now what are we doing? We're selling citizenship, but we're not raping and pillaging or plundering our way to economic success like Europe did. So you can also tell that story of the way that former colonial microstates, how they get by.
Any last questions? Thank you. Well, in that case, I mean, Kristin, I'm looking forward to further conversations. That was a really fantastic talk, and it's just so important for understanding. And I love the way in which it's very, very focused at one level, but it also opens up these huge issues around wealth, around globalization, around capitalism, intermediation, the role of intermediaries, wealth managers, and so it's really fantastic. And it's going to be a very, very important book. So thank you. It's been a great pleasure for me to chair the event. Thank you to Kristin. I just want to remind you that there are future RAI seminars. The link is on the chat if any of you want to find out more information about those. And until we meet again, therefore, I'd like to thank you all and wish you a good afternoon, London terms, depending on where you're from. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.